are very glad you are here today. If you'll get out your outlines, your message notes, get your Bibles out. We're in a series, like I said, on how God can turn your setbacks into comebacks. And this week we're going to talk about how when it looks like it's too late to have a comeback. How when it looks like you may have left it a little bit too long. Now, when I was growing up, we always had a garden. And by the way, I just can't let this moment go by without saying, growing up in Lubbock, basically you had two things to occupy your time. One of them was talking to people because there wasn't anything else to do. And the second was occasionally Texas Tech would win something. And there we are you notice that now that we've won something, it's we, it's not they, in the Final Four of the NC2A basketball tournament. So yeah, there we go. So I just had to get that in, and I'm very happy about that. Let's get back to the lesson. All right, I can spend the rest of the lesson talking about that. But we always had a vegetable garden. Not that you could grow much in Lubbock because it didn't rain, and the water was very, very rough. It was hard water. But we always attempted to have a vegetable garden. Now, garden was an interesting thing back then because it was arid. It was semi-arid, lots of sun, not much water, and so it was an interesting deal. My mother and father had two different philosophies on plants. Now, if you've been here longer than 14 years, you remember my mother and father. My father preached here for a while, and my father believed that when plants got to a certain point, they were not going to make a comeback in that. In other words, when the leaves fell off, got brown and fell off, and when the plant got brown and brittle, he was ready to pull them up out of there. And so he would say, now let me tell you about my father. My father, I was the first remote control in the history of the world. And you say, well, because when they came out, somebody said, you're going to get a remote control. My father always said to me, son, get up and change the channel. And so that was the way my father did things. So when it came time to cull out the garden of the dead plants, Bill would say to me, son, get a bag, go get those dead plants out. My mother, on the other hand, didn't ever believe they were dead. They were hibernating. She believed that all you had to do was care for them and treat them right, and they would come back. So they just didn't have enough water, and they didn't have enough care. And when I would get out there and get ready to start cleaning the garden out, she would always come out, and she would say, no, don't leave them. Water them really good, and there will be something in there that would come back. And so she wouldn't let me pull them up. And I would stop and would go stand off to the side because I knew, after he'd done this a few years, I knew that my father was going to come back out and say, why are you standing off to the side? I told you to get working. Let's go. And so I'd head back out there, and I knew that in just a minute my mother would come back out, and she would say, no, don't you pull a thing out of there. They just need a good drink, and they'll come back. In that. They said, didn't that frustrate you? No, it didn't. Because before long it would be dark. And one of my favorite things to do is just stand around and not do much in that. I call that observation. I learned. And so it was a great way to kill a couple of hours watching Bill and Dot argue passively over what they were going to do with the garden and the plants. Now I want to bring that illustration up to say this. A lot of us, we feel like that about us. That we feel we get past a certain point and God can't use us anymore. Now let me just say a couple of things about that. Number one, we're not plants. We're people. And as long as you are breathing and on this planet, there's still time for a comeback in your life. And we're going to talk about Moses today. Because Moses is a perfect, powerful example about how God works in your life when it's too late, when you think it's too late for a comeback. Now, here's the thing that's been kind of surprising to me about this series, because I thought when I started putting this series together that it would be a real uplifter for folks in that. And it's been kind of surprising how some of you guys, and I appreciate your comments and your openness and your honesty, but about some of you guys have come up and said, this has been a really painful series. This has been a difficult series. Because I've looked around the room and I've seen how other folks seem primed for the comeback, But in my own life, the issue that hit me happened so long ago, or it was so horrendous, or it was so horrible or so painful that there's absolutely no way I could have a comeback. And if that's you, I hope today's lesson specifically gives you some hope, because Moses' story is a story full of comebacks. Moses' story starts with a comeback. If you remember the history of the time, the Pharaoh said that all babies were supposed to be killed. And so so Moses' family puts him in a little basket and floats him down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and adopts him into Pharaoh's family, and Moses, who was supposed to be killed, ends up being adopted into Pharaoh's family. That's a pretty good comeback for a newborn, wouldn't you say? I mean, you're supposed to not be in here at all, and now you're growing up in the palace. And it looks like he's set for life. It looks like he's going to end up a prince. It looks like this is going to be a fairy tale come true. But then this happens one day when Moses was 40 years old, and he's been living in the palace all this time. He decided to visit his relatives, the people of Israel. And he saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite, and so Moses came to the man's defense, and he avenged him, killing the Egyptian. Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would realize that God had sent him to rescue them, but they didn't. The next day he visited them again, and he saw two men of Israel fighting. He tried to be a peacemaker. Men, he said, you're brothers. Why are you fighting each other? But the man in the wrong pushed Moses aside and said, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And when Moses heard that, he fled the country, and he lived as a foreigner in the land of Midian. Now he lived there 40 years, totally afraid, because he was afraid somebody would find out just exactly who he was and bring him back to Egypt, where he would have to stand trial, not as somebody who was born in the palace, but somebody who was a foreigner who had killed in cold blood an Egyptian. And he was afraid of the consequences. And so while he lived in that other country, he found and married a girl, a young lady, and lived his life sort of in anonymity as a shepherd. That was his lot in life. As far as he was concerned, he had blown his opportunity to be the prince in the family of the Pharaoh. The Bible goes on, one day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock far into the wilderness, and he came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of the bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. Okay, now you and I, through the ability of looking back, can see right now God setting Moses up for another comeback. Moses doesn't have that benefit of seeing what's going to come up in his life. All he knows is that he's walking through the desert and he sees a bush that's on fire, which is not a big deal in itself because the desert's hot and a lot of times stuff catches on fire. And that's no different. What's different about this is that even though the bush was on fire, it wasn't burning up. Now, that was the unique fact. Now, I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to do a Sam. I want you to put your finger right there and just leave that for a second, okay? And we're going to go look at a thought. Because I think a lot of us have a burning bush experience in our lives back there somewhere. Let me explain, okay? What I mean is being in the middle of our routine. Being in the middle of the stuff that we do absolutely every single day. When we least expect it, we get a surprise invitation by God. All right, I want you to hear me out, all right? This was a routine day, just like every other day in the life of Moses. He was tending sheep just like he did every single day. Just like some of us got up today and came to church just like we did last Sunday, and the Sunday before that, and the Sunday before that, and the Sunday before that, and every Sunday since we can remember. And you're sitting in here in this auditorium, and it's just one more Sunday. This was Moses' 40th year of being a shepherd. He had woken up in the same landscape, with the same sheep, and with the same water, and with the same mountains, and in the same hills, and with the same everything for 14,600 days. what in the world was going to be different about today. So Moses is surprised when God shows up. Because you see, God's presence changes things. God's presence changed things for him. God's presence changes things for us. God's presence caused a bush to catch on fire but not burn. God's presence can cause a church to start doing things that it was never capable of doing before. God's presence can cause a church that was dead to come to life. And Moses decides he needs to get a better look at this bush that's on fire but it's not burning up. So look what happens, Exodus 3, 4 through 5. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called him from the middle of the bush. Moses, Moses. Moses said, here I am. God said, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. Now here's what really surprised Moses about this event. Because in the middle of all this surprise of the day, the bush that's on fire and not burning, he heard his name. Isn't it amazing how you can hear your name? You're in an airport, and there are thousands of people milling around, and over the speaker system you can hear, David Yasko, please come to the customer service center. Or you're somewhere and you can hear your name, and it's amazing how you can pick that out of the crowd, but there wasn't a crowd, but Moses heard his name. And that's what surprised him. And that's what I'm praying for us today. That somehow in this lesson today, you're going to hear your name. God said to Moses, this is holy ground. I want you to take your shoes off. Now, one of the things that I want you to know is that right now, right here, right now, you can be on holy ground. Right here, right now, you can invite God into your presence and you could be on holy ground. Now, I want you to know that just for the benefit of the people around you, leave your shoes on, okay? And it might be unpleasant. And if, the only thing that we could have like a bush in here would be your hair. And if anybody's hair catches on fire, I'm the first one out the back door. Let me just say that as a statement, okay? I am saying that I would love for you today to make a space in your life for God to show up and challenge you to make the comeback that you don't think you've got in you. You see, it's not easy when God challenges us to make a comeback because we may not want to go in that particular direction. Because with every comeback, we've got fear and risk involved. You see, the history of this is that Moses was raised in a royal household. Moses had run away to Midian because he had killed a man. So Moses has this meeting with God, and God says, I want you to make a comeback to Egypt. I want you to go back there and face down Pharaoh, and I want you to lead my people out of bondage. And the last place in the world Moses wanted to go was back to see Pharaoh because he knew Pharaoh's temper. He grew up with Pharaoh's temper. He grew up in that dysfunctional setting that ran on anger and fear and people raising their voices and people getting chewed out and death is a constant companion, and he didn't want to go there. And so he argues with God, and in this meeting about comebacks, God told Moses, you're going to talk to Pharaoh for me. And before Moses would agree to do that, Moses said to God, I need to ask you 4 questions. Now, in the comeback that God is planning for you, I want you to know you get to talk to God. And I want you to listen to the questions that Moses asked, because chances are they're going to be the questions that you ask God. Now, question number 1 that Moses asked God was this: who am I to do this job? Who am I to do this assignment? I am a shepherd. I'm out here in the wilderness. I am a runaway. I am a fugitive. Exodus 3:11 through 12. But Moses protested to God. All right, so Moses is in protest mode. And he's saying, listen, I got 6 or 7 reasons here why this won't work. And God answered every single one of those with one particular phrase. He said, here's why: because I'll be with you. Moses said, I'm not qualified. I'm not qualified to do what it is that you want. Now, here's the bottom line, okay? Yeah, I guess look up here for a second. Here's the bottom line. If all we're doing in our life in order to accomplish what God has for us is looking at our qualifications, then it's never going to work. If we're looking at our qualifications to grow this church, then it's never going to work. Because we're always going to be too short, too tall, too fat, too skinny, too hairy, too bald, too dumb, too young, too old. We're always going to find something that keeps us from doing what God wants to have done in our life. So God said, Moses, don't look at your qualification. That's got you where you are right now. Your qualifications have got you out in the middle of the wilderness. You see, sometimes we settle into our setbacks, and it just becomes the fabric of our lives. We settle into our setbacks, and we're just happy in our setbacks. That's what happened to Moses. And so we think, well, that's just the way it is. And sometimes we hear God knock, and we feel like, I'm the last person in the world that could answer that door. And that's how Moses was feeling, standing in front of the bush that was on fire but wasn't. God has an answer for Moses, which is the same answer for us when he answers us, when we think he can't use us. He says, I will be with you. Now, I want you to notice what he didn't do. All right, I want you to notice, because he didn't do what I would be tempted to do if I was God. He didn't try to build Moses up. He didn't try to give him a pep talk. He didn't try to say, oh, Moses, you can do it. He didn't, I would have said to him, Moses, you are the most qualified person in the world to do this. You're the only Israelite who grew up in an Egyptian household of Pharaoh. You are bilingual. You are bicultural. You are a man of learning and stature. You are handsome. You've lived the life of a royal. You've lived the life of a common shepherd. I was trying to think of a way to make the statement of how he's lived both lives. And the only thing I could come up with, I got to admit, when I was growing up, past growing up, when I was in my 40s, that I loved the professional wrestling. I just have to say I love the professional wrestling. And one of my favorite wrestlers was the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. And you can edit that out of this tape if you want to. I would be appreciative of that, because he got up there one time and he says, I have wined and dined with kings and queens and slept in alleys and ate pork and beans. And Moses could have given that speech. But that's not what God says. God doesn't say, Moses, you're uniquely qualified to do this. God just looks at him and says, you know what? I'll be there. You see, if I'm going to look for God's comeback in my life, I can't look at who I am. I've got to look at who God is. I have spoken in my life to a lot of young preachers and ministers and folks that want to be influences in the church. And I used to talk to them in groups. 13, 14 years ago, I decided, I quit doing that. There are younger, much cooler ministers and mentors out there now that go do groups, and that's perfectly fine with me. I like doing this mentoring stuff one at a time. Over the past 4 days, over the past 2 days and 2 days to come, I've been with two, and I'll be with two Monday and Tuesday. And we sit down and we talk about what it means to live a life, and what it means to have integrity, and what it means to not be perfect, and what it means to, especially if you're a minister, to start out young and perfect and get better from there, and all of that stuff like that. And they're surprised when we get right down and honest that the biggest feeling I've had in my life, both professionally and personally, is my lifelong fear of inadequacy in that. Because a lot of times I don't feel like a very good person, never mind preacher. I'm not fishing for your compliments. I promise I'm not. In fact, I'd rather you just pretend I didn't say that, but reality's reality. And I tell them it may have to do with growing up with a father who was famous in the churches of Christ, who was famous as a church builder and a soul winner and a leadership builder. And I talk about how living with that shadow, I chose to run from that shadow. I went overseas. I went to the Northwest. I went up to the Midwest, and have listened to people stop and tell me all my life how great and how wonderful and how awesome of a father that I've got. And I believe him. I believe him with all my heart that he is. But you see, growing up, he gave 100% to that, and there's not much left after that. Because I didn't see that person that much. And I tell him that a lot of times I feel absolutely inadequate, that I love him so much, but I struggle with that legacy. And I've struggled with that my entire life. I used to think if I said the right prayer, or read the right verse, or did the right Bible study, those feelings would go away, but they haven't. And I tell these young preachers and young men that those feelings, that what I've learned is that what I need to know is that God's going to be with me in the middle of the inadequacy. That God doesn't take the feeling away, but he walks with me right down through the middle of it. Here's the interesting thing. Some of these young men that I talk to, they've got famous fathers. They've got fathers that are preachers and coaches and elders and administrators in Christian colleges. And every single one of those young men says to me, I feel so inadequate. Because all these people come by and tell me what a great person my father is, and I can't measure up because I never got to see much of that. And I said to them, do you know why you feel inadequate? And they say, no. And I said, because we are inadequate. The things that God wants to do through you, you are inadequate to do by yourself. Only God is adequate in their scope. 2 Corinthians 3:5. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything that's coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God. And that's why God didn't build Moses up. God just said to Moses, hey, I'm with you. That's all you need, which led to question number 2. And that is, Moses said to God, if you're going to be with me, then who are you? Okay, now we've figured out who I am. I'm a nobody that has you with me. So who are you? It's kind of like you saying, excuse me for doubting you, God, but I need to know some things about who you are. Exodus 3:13 through 14. But Moses protested, protesting again, if I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they'll ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moses said to him, I am what? Finish your sentence, God. I'm what? I'm what? I'm the big guy. I'm the head cheese. I'm what? I am what? Finish your sentence. What are you, God? Now, what God is trying to tell him is that I'm the God that can meet every single need that you have. In a world where we say, I wish it would be different. I wish I'd done that. I wish I'd made that choice. God says it's not about wishes. It's about I am. I am the one who can take you to the next step. I am the one who can meet your need. I am the one who can help you get this done. Moses says, I think I've got it. I think I know who you are, and I think I know who I am, but I still got a question. Question number 3. Question number 3, Moses said to God, what about them? Now that's a good question. What about them? What about these people that I'm going to? All right, I know who you are. I know who I am. I need to know who they are. He says, I hate to be difficult, God, but I got a bad feeling about this. Because the last interaction I had with them, when I tried to show them how much I cared for them and how much I love them, they worked me over. They chewed me out. So I've got a bad feeling about this. What am I supposed to do? Go say, I was out there and I was talking to this bush one day and it was on fire, but it wasn't on fire. And God talked to me about it. And that's not going to go well. They're going to be just as confused as I am now. So God, this is a recipe for disaster. Tell me what to say. Exodus 4. Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? Then the Lord asked him, what's in your hand? Now that's an interesting answer, isn't it? Because you're never supposed to answer a question with a question. So the Lord broke all the grammatical rules here, all right? He said, what's that in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. But what about them? All right, stop right there. Put your finger right there, okay? Let me ask you a question. The they. In this case, it was the other folks of Israel. But the theys in your life, because you've got theys in your life. You got them in your life. And what are they keeping you from accomplishing in your life? I'm talking about the people you look up to, or the people who look up to you, or the people who intimidate you, or the people who remember you growing up and they've known you all your life, and all they see when they see you is a 10-year-old kid. I've got a son who is 39 years old. But in my life, I can't help but see him as a 15-year-old because that's the age that's burned into my mind. And sometimes we have difficulties communicating because in my mind I'm talking to this kid and he's not a kid, he's a man. And so sometimes our communication has issues. Because what if that's you? And the people that you're trying to step up and lead don't take you seriously? Or what if they used to make fun of you? Or they might reject you if they see you stepping up. And they're the people who were there when you failed and you failed big, and they make sure you remember that you failed and you failed big. How are they keeping God's best out of your life? Because you're thinking, okay, if I step forward, what if they reject me? You know, what if they ignore me? What if they look down on me? What if they don't like me? And so we talk ourselves out from that moment on of never even taking the risk. Sometimes, as strange as it is, it's people who are already dead. And yet their voice comes out in our mind and in our head. And Moses, full of the fear of them, asks what to do with the fear of what other people think. Now, I want you to notice right there that God doesn't say, okay, Moses, look at me. What God does say to Moses is, what do you have in your hand? He says, I have a shepherd's crook. So God says, then use what you've got. Throw it on the ground, the Lord told him. Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back and then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. Moses reached down and he grabbed it and turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand. Okay, in dealing with the fear of them, by the way, you know, I've got a shepherd's staff. All of our elders have a shepherd's staff. When I read this thing, I got it down and I threw it down on the ground and I stepped back just in case, just kind of in case. It did not turn into a snake, but I believe this, okay? And it says, in dealing with the fear of them, you take what's in your hand and you put it in God's hand, and you throw it down, and you trust God with it. And that's the moment that the fear starts being dealt with, because when it's in God's hands, things change. In God's hands, a problem starts being a promise of personal growth. In God's hands, a disappointment becomes a dream. In God's hands, a cross of torture becomes a place of forgiveness. In God's hands, a tomb becomes a place of resurrection. In God's hands, things change. You guys that have been here for a while, you've heard that one before. Now, Moses had just seen this miracle. Moses saw that happen. And if I was Moses, I would have shut up the questions right there. It would have been, okay, God, you've got me. But Moses has got one more. And he knows, and he saved it for last, because he believes he can prove it's the reason that he's not God's man. And it's in Exodus 4:10 through 11. So Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh, Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been. I'm not now, even though you've spoken to me. And so the excuse is all God's fault. He says, you've spoken to me, but I still can't speak clearly. And so question number 4 that he comes out is that, look, I may be a great leader, but people can't understand me. And so question 4 is this: you've spoken to me, but people can't understand me. You see, what we understand now is that Moses had a speech impediment. And Moses was reasoning that he could not be a great leader because the people could not understand him. So the Lord said to Moses, who made your mouth? And Moses says, you did. And God said back to Moses, how about we have this basic understanding? Moses said, okay. God says, how about I accept and I will be aware of your shortcomings, but you accept and you be aware of my power and my overwhelming strength in the middle of your shortcomings. And Moses, when it comes time to talk to Pharaoh, you won't be speaking your words. You will be speaking my words when it comes to that meeting. Now let's just get personal as we wind this up. Let's just get personal. What step of faith do we have to take to get us ready for this comeback? Because the book of Hebrews talks about Moses and his faith, and it tells us a couple of things about the kind of faith he had. Hebrews 11:26. Moses regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. He had his eye on the one that no eye can see. You see, he who can see the invisible, he who has his eye on the invisible, can do the impossible. We cannot see God, but he is more powerful and more real than anything we can see. So how do we get out of a world that is this big? How do we get out of being stuck in a world that's this big? Well, we realize God's bigger. I mean, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was a somebody, and then he spent years in the desert believing he was a nobody, and then he spent the last 40 years of his life realizing what God can do with a nobody, and God's bigger than anything that's happening in your lives, and he has the power of the comeback. And it started where it started with Moses. We've got to hear God call our name. Here in just a minute, we're going to have an invitation song. And I want you to hear God call your name as you're ready to be baptized into Christ. And I want you to hear God call your name as you're ready to be restored into Christ. And I want you to hear God call your name as you're considering placing membership here. And I want you to hear God call your name as you get ready to make the comeback of your life, because it's not too late. The book of Joel, the Lord said, it's not too late. You can still return to me with all your heart. I just don't want anybody to be afraid of the comeback, because we have comebacks all the time. So you ready? Are you ready? Then come back while we stand and while we sing.
How great the chasm that lay between us, how high the mountain